their hypertrophy will be limited more so by how much time they have than potentially by recovery. So
Totally.
if you're someone who's limited by time, if you can use supersets and all of a sudden go from getting, say, 10, 15 sets for your biceps in a given week to say 15, 20 or 20 or 25, and that increases your hypertrophy, that's a huge deal.
Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for RP Strength. I'm here with Coach Dr. Milo Wolf of the Wolf Pack, which is you and Pack, Dr. Pack. A wolf pack of two, that's not a lot of wolves, but you guys are both quite large, so
We make up for it.
with size.
Fun fact, we want to call ourselves Wolfpack, and our podcast Wolfpack, but a backpack brand beat us to the punch. And we had to
Oh, come
away.
on. There's no way that they're going to sue you for,
using our names.
I mean, it's your names. It's also a podcast.
That's
We're not
true.
trying to make a backpack.
That's true.
Is it a nice backpack?
I've heard it is, and I've seen them at expos and stuff, but I can't speak to their quality.
Good enough.
I think it is our Wolfpack.
You should fight for it legally until you spend all of your money doing it.
And lose.
Yes.
Just
Well,
have more
loser.
money than
We don't have a choice in that. We just fight. That's our job. And speaking of fighting, you know what? Enough fighting. We need more love in this world. And one of the best ways to show love is through summarizing recent literature about how to get jacked by training less. Now, it sounds like clickbait to me. Milo, open up my ears a little bit. Explain to me what's going on so that I'm no longer as confused and upset as I am currently.
If you use the right training strategy, you can probably train less and grow more muscle. Before the commenters get all twisted up trying to call me a clickbaiter, there's a recent technique that we've researched a fair amount now called antagonistic paired supersets, or even just non-overlapping supersets, as you've previously called them. And we just finished conducting a study on this exact topic. In trained lifters with around, on average, 3 years of training experience, we compared doing all of your training for the upper body as either traditional sets, where you do one exercise followed by the next, followed by the next, followed by the next, etc. In this case, that was
With rest breaks.
correct. Traditional rest breaks with the Smith machine bench press, the lat pull down, the dumbbell curl, the cable push down, the leg extension, and the leg curl.
Okay.
So a relatively full body complete program. We compared that approach of just taking traditional rest times to supersetting those 6 exercises into 3 pairs. The Smith machine bench press supersetted with the lat pull down, the dumbbell curl supersetted with the push down, and the leg extension supersetted with the leg curl.
What's the rest time like when you do those supersets?
I believe it was 2 minutes from top of my head. So
2 minutes.
between each set for the traditional group
Okay.
and 2 minutes between each superset for the superset group. So they would do a set of bench press and then straight away go into a set of pull downs and then rest 2 minutes.
Got it.
After that 2 minute break, do another set of bench press, immediately followed by a set of pull downs,
Got it.
then rest 2 minutes again.
So we're saving 2 minutes every time because we're not resting 2 after each, just 2 after the combination.
Correct.
Which is good time savings
Correct.
there. All right. What did you find?
Well, when looking at total session duration, as you'd expect, the superset group saved around 40% of total workout time.
That's good.
That's a meaningful amount, yeah.
That's a very meaningful amount. I want to save 100% of workout time. Not quite there yet. 40% is realistic. 40% is something like if I normally train for an hour and a half-ish, now I'm training for like an hour-ish.
Yeah.
Not a 20-minute time saver, but a big deal.
Yeah.
And obviously those guys, since they skipped out on the work of resting and waiting, they must have not grown as much, right?
Well, no,
Ah.
they actually grew the exact same amount.
Oh, damn.
Now,
Okay.
there have been previous studies on the exact same topic, where this is now the 3rd study looking at this idea of supersetting 2 movements with no muscular overlap, or ideally even 2 movements that are antagonistic in nature. So for example, a bicep curl, where you're flexing the elbow, and a cable push down, where you're extending the elbow.
And real quick, just for folks not in the know, the unrelated part means like you do a squat and then after you do a push-up. Pushing up is not antagonistic to squats, but it doesn't involve any overlapping musculature. So basically you just, one muscle is resting while the other is training, then they're both resting, and then the next muscle goes.
Correct. One caveat I would give to that specific example is that I'm not sure how this generalizes to more compound movements that just tire you out a ton in general. Like, I'm not sure I would personally try supersetting a squat with anything else quite yet, just because the squat uses so much musculature and imposes such systemic fatigue overall that it might just be too much fatigue to really superset effectively with a different exercise at all, if that makes sense. Speculating, because we don't have direct research on the squat in the first place. But I certainly think for most upper body movements, and most, if not all, isolation movements, you can likely superset 2 movements with no muscular overlap, save a bunch of time, and get mostly the same stimulus.
Okay.
That is certainly what the research to date suggests. As I mentioned, this now makes for the 3rd study, looking at supersets versus traditional training. We have one study on banded curls and band and tricep extensions, doing them separately or supersets, and the other study is on leg curls and leg extensions. In both of these studies, as in the present one, we saw largely similar hypertrophy. So all 3 studies we have on this concept, as far as actually looking at hypertrophy, have found similar hypertrophy from doing traditional training versus using these supersets. So all the research really suggests that you could be saving up to 30 to 40% of the time, maybe even more, by doing most of your exercises that lend themselves to this technique as supersets. There's a few small caveats.
Okay.
Specifically, in the study we just conducted, we did have around twice as many reports of nausea in the superset group as compared to the traditional group.
That makes sense.
Because essentially you're increasing the training density, creating greater systemic demands, and that seemingly led to a bit more sort of overall nausea-related issues.
So you just don't get as many rest breaks, so you get more tired and throwy uppy.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Likewise, at first, when they started the study, we asked them how hard they found both the superset training session and the traditional training session. And just when being tested for the first time on these sessions, they found the superset training session a bit more challenging. When they had to rate it out of 10, they rated the superset session as around 8 out of 10, and the traditional session is about a 7 out of 10. So it is a bit more challenging, all else being equal. You're doing the same amount of training in just less time, so you're training harder in a way. However, when you actually averaged their difficulty ratings across the study, they were pretty similar between the superset group and the traditional group. So it might be something you get used to.
Sure.
That is my suspicion.
Well, you get used to almost everything. The real question is, by the time you get used to it, is it still harder than the other thing? Like, if you sprint for 30 seconds versus run all out for an hour, even when you get used to running all out for an hour, sprinting for 30 seconds is still easier. But in this case, at the end of the study, you guys noticed no difference in ratings.
On average,
so on average, pretty similar.
Now, ideally, we would have done a session where the superset group did the traditional session at the end as well, so we can then compare how they experienced the traditional session, having done the harder thing of doing the supersets, but we didn't. However, just looking at the average ratings across the study, it would suggest that you get used to it to a reasonable extent.
Yeah, they'd probably just be pretty bored with a traditional session because it takes so much damn time kind of sitting around for no reason.
Now, these 3 studies aren't all we have. We also have around 5 acute studies looking at the concept of supersets and looking at performance specifically. And broadly speaking, across these 5 or so acute studies looking at whether or not supersetting exercises impairs performance as compared to doing just one exercise with traditional rest intervals followed by the next, you generally see similar performance, or in the case of antagonistic paired supersets, sometimes even slightly better performance.
Explain why.
When you're bench pressing, and especially when you're untrained, your body will, to an extent, still activate your back musculature, which can impair how easily you're able to lift the weight because it directly resists the motion.
Listen, non-productive co-contraction. You're just kind of like,
correct,
but you're not pointing all your muscles in the direction you need them to go.
Yep.
Okay. That's actually how beginners grapple too. When they do jiu-jitsu, they just kind of constrict everything. And you're like, well, actually, that's not. It's a nice little bow constrictor thing, and it makes you really tired and so on and so forth. But for them, because when the bench press tires out your chest doesn't interfere as much with your lat pull downs because your body's like, chest is too tired, bucket, we're not going to co-contract. And then you end up having a better performance on the lat pull downs. So that's quite interesting. Now, you may not actually have a better muscular stimulus from that second set because the co-contraction still provides resistance against your muscles. So your lats might get the same stimulus one way or the other, but in the condition in which you're co-contracting a lot, you're going to have a lot more fatigue because you're using a lot of your own internal resistance versus just letting the weights do the work.
Certainly. And I think the research on hypertrophy would kind of support that hypothesis in the sense that we don't observe better hypertrophy typically from supersetting. We observe similar hypertrophy.
Right.
But at the very least, in beginners, and these studies, except for the one we just conducted, were mostly in beginners, you see similar or slightly better performance by supersetting to antagonistic motions.
Sure.
But overall, the research does seem to be suggesting that, hey, if you want to save time in your sessions up to like 40% or maybe even more, supersetting different movements that don't have any overlap can be one of the best ways to do that.
Amazing. Who does this not work for / is maybe a bad idea? I can think of a few things. What can you think of?
Sure. Just on a principled level, I could imagine it not working super well for super advanced people, where even a set of bench press of say 5 or 10 reps or a set of bent over rows or what have you could create enough systemic fatigue to become an issue.
Yeah.
Importantly, that is us speculating, right? The research we have on relatively trained lifters of like 3 years of training experience, these people were relatively jacked, did still find similar hypertrophy when supersetting versus taking traditional rest intervals.
Yeah.
So this is me speculating, but someone in the comments might say, this wouldn't work for me, I'm way too strong. And that may or may not be true. The evidence doesn't support that yet, but I could see it potentially being a concern, if that makes sense.
Sure. If you're really strong, you exact more systemic fatigue from any single given movement. And that fatigue doesn't just go away right after, so you can't just go to bicep curls after bench press. So that's automatically a concern. Larger muscle mass exercises, compound movements, maybe like squats and deadlifts, you would be so systemically fatigued right after and cardiovascularly fatigued, that next set of whatever you're doing is just going to be way, way underperforming.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things are definitely a concern. The other thing is some lifts, for more advanced people, I think many lifts turn into a very mind-muscle connection, zen in on the technique and really pound that muscle super well. 3 years of lifting, you're just going through the movements. Mind-muscle connection doesn't mean anything to most people of that advancement. But if you're really trying to get everything you can out of incline barbell bench, it's not going to be possible right after you got done pull downs, because you need to settle and really get your mind right and really push super, super hard. So in those cases, what would happen experientially, and I've tried this before, is you just don't get as much tension perception in the target muscles that it's not working for. You don't get as big of a pump and your volume drops off significantly. Let's say you're doing squat crushers with 100 pounds in a barbell, but now you're doing them, let's say after a set of curls. Typically you get 100 for a set of 12. Now it's set of 7, set of 5, set of 4. I mean, if you do enough sets, technically speaking, you do it, but then you're not really saving time anymore, and you're adding quite a bit of fatigue training that much. So those are the things I can think of that would hypothetically take this idea of supersetting in relative beginners, moderately trained lifters, and mostly with isolation movements, and kind of predict how, if you expanded it out to more advanced people with more compound movements, how it might not work every time or as intended, but also you could rest a little longer for those. And also my best advice to folks listening is try this with a bunch of different movements. You could be pleasantly surprised. For example, pull-ups are technically a compound movement, quite heavy. My experience, they just don't systemically fatigue you that much. As soon as I get off of doing pull-ups, I'm like, So you might say, on pull-ups and push-ups, that's not going to work. I need bicep curls and tricep extensions. But it turns out like after pull-ups, you can. But then again, after barbell blunt rows, you just lay down in a corner and want to die. So very much give it a shot, but don't expect this to transfer ultra well. But also you can be pleasantly surprised and find that you can superset a lot more shit than you thought you could.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think to push back a little bit on some of those, one, when it comes to mind-muscle connection, I think that bodybuilding culture has emphasized it for a long time, and there is a theoretical role for it. But as far as direct research confirming that focusing on mind-muscle connection is a necessity for maximizing hypertrophy, we only have one study currently. It does kind of support it. Some outcomes were in favor of the mind-muscle connection group. Some were in favor of the external focus group, essentially just hoisting the weight or being explosive. When it comes to more advanced lifters specifically, I do agree that with them being more trained, them training would exact more systemic fatigue. They're able to lift more load for more reps, have a greater overall workload. However, on the other hand, more trained lifters also have greater conditioning. So to an extent, I would expect those two things to counteract each other. I think that until we have research in trained lifters, I would personally be comfortable with the assumption that it generalizes reasonably well to more trained lifters, especially because we have some research in reasonably trained lifters. And as far as most people's muscle growth potential goes, within their first 3 years of lifting, they'll see most of their muscle growth that they'll ever get.
How do you know that?
Just from sort of like the muscle growth curve over time. I think that
How do you
the
know
first
that?
6 to 12 months, anecdotally from the research, you generally observe, in fact, we just had a meta-analysis on volume and frequency, where we did a subgroup analysis by training status. And you see that, we'll speak about this in future videos actually, when you look at specifically only untrained participants and studies in untrained participants versus specifically studies in only trained participants, both demographics benefit from more volume, for example, but the absolute rate of growth just shifts down. So all else being equal, as you get more advanced, you will see less muscle growth. That is pretty widely accepted within the literature.
Mm-hmm.
So I would personally expect that if we observe in relatively trained lifters of on average 3 years of training experience, that there is no detriment to using supersets, and you don't see that much more muscle growth on average past 3 years of lifting, like it's a slow process. You can certainly add meaningful amounts of muscle, but it will take a long time. That person who's been lifting for 3 years isn't going to be that dissimilar for someone who's been lifting for 5 to 10 years. So the same generalizable principles would still apply. So I personally expect this to generalize reasonably well to trained lifters as well.
How long have you been lifting?
10 years, 10 or 11 years.
How similar is your strength currently to 3 years?
I would say maybe 5 to 20% above it, thereabouts.
And what about lean mass?
Similar, I would say like 5 to 20%, maybe a bit less than that above it, relative to men. Obviously, I'm natural, which is a conversation to be had. This might be entirely different in enhanced lifters who've put on a lot more muscle mass and who specifically might be using certain compounds that preferentially stimulate hypertrophy as opposed to conditioning or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly I think within natural lifters, this can be a great tool, even with more advanced trainees potentially.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I think how strong you are absolutely probably makes a really big difference. You don't really out-condition squatting 405 for 10.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to crush you. And if you're well-conditioned enough to do it, you're no longer receiving a big stimulus from it. But if you're comparably strong to what you were around 3 years of training, 8 years in, let's say, yeah, the conditioning shouldn't be a big factor and could actually be to your advantage. I guess it depends on your training style as well. Interesting. So yeah, I hear you on that stuff. I think a lot of people try to pat themselves on the back too early for being advanced lifters and stuff like that. But there is a big difference I've noticed with people able to continue to put out high degrees of effort in a superset versus they really need a rest break. And they could have quite good conditioning, but they just pour more of their effort into that first set. Mm-hmm. And they just need more recovery. And so I think the ultimate arbiter of, is this working for you, is we'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
And if it's a giant disappointment, well, this ain't it. But if it seems to give you perceptively similar results, your strength is increasing similarly over time, your muscles are looking at least as big, if not bigger, then yeah, these sounds like really good strategies to save some time. The only downside here is like tough to pull off at a busy commercial gym sometimes, but also you can drag a pair of dumbbells over to, next to a lat pull down and make it work.
Yep. So. Agreed. I think one other edge case where supersets might not work as well, obviously you've mentioned practical constraints where your gym might not allow for it. With super high rep compound work, that is technically where I would expect energy expenditure per set or what have you to go up, because you're able to lift, say, 50% of your max for 20, 25 reps typically. Whereas if you're doing a heavy set of 5 or 6, the energy expenditure of that set might be relatively low. So supersetting a relatively heavy set with another relatively heavy set might be more feasible from a systemic fatigue standpoint. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to, say, sets of 10, 15, 20 or more on compound movements, supersetting 2 compound movements, even if it's something like a push-up, I'm not sure would work as well as something heavier, just in terms of recovering between one exercise and the next when you're going back to back. I think a good general heuristic for figuring out whether or not supersets are likely to work for your application, the exercise you're picking, and your training experience is if you notice a substantial drop-off in your performance relative to your performance if you weren't supersetting those 2 exercises, that is a decent sign that you might be harming hypertrophy, I think. Because then that likely implies that fatigue from one exercise is bleeding over into the next.
Yeah.
And in the research, that doesn't happen. And in that context, we see similar hypertrophy.
Mhm.
But if it starts harming hypertrophy, I could personally see where that might not be the best case for hypertrophy. So that's where I would avoid it.
Yeah, that makes sense. A rule I typically use, and you can adjust for this by doing more sets, but if you're losing a third of your reps on that second exercise compared to normal, man, that's tough.
Yep.
Another way to think about it is this. If you are doing tricep extensions first, bicep curls second, typically on bicep curls with that weight, you would get 15 reps. Now you're getting 10. What is the source of the fatigue that is capping those 5 reps, taking them away from you? Systemic. Local fatigue is hypertrophic. Systemic fatigue is not. So is it, in a sense, true that the real RIR as measured at the level of the contractile tissue itself is now 5? Yeah. That's not good.
Indeed.
If we believe RIR has some kind of effect on hypertrophy, which is a nuanced take itself, but it probably has some, then yeah, if typically you do 15, now you do 12, yeah, no big deal.
Yep.
Typically you do 15, now you do 9. You got 6 reps there, more or less every set. Your 6 most hypertrophic reps that you're just no longer getting. But if you can maintain a high level of performance and you don't have to take longer rest breaks, you just saved yourself a lot of time. And one thing I'd like to point out on that, and let's see if you agree with this one, is some people will say, well, I like to be in the gym and I like gains. I don't need to save time. And that's true. But the gym is itself a special kind of fatiguing. Being in the gym, being around fight or flight stuff, not being on your home couch relaxing, basically, is an opportunity not used as well to recover and adapt as could be. So to those people that say, well, I don't want any shortcuts, think of it this way. It's not a shortcut. It's an opportunity to take 30 minutes of gym time and at no cost of hypertrophy, replace it with 30 minutes of relaxation time. That'll probably yield net hypertrophy benefit. So, people spend a lot of time working out. If you give them the same results in less time, you spend less time in the gym, which, yes, sounds less hardcore, but you don't grow in the gym. Everyone knows that. And so if you can do your duty and get out quicker to have more rest time, wouldn't that be a benefit in your view?
I would agree with that. And I think even more importantly, most people have some time constraints on how much time they can spend in the gym. And we know from the research, as we'll discuss in a future video or past video, that more volume yields more hypertrophy up to a relatively high point, at least on average within these studies. So if you have 5 hours in the gym per week, or even 7, most people have some constraint because you have a job, because you have a family, you have relationships, maybe even hobbies, or maybe even friends.
Ooh, careful. Not on this channel. Hopes for friends, which hoping does take up its own time. So time for hoping.
Thinking about having friends.
Yes.
That's good.
Pretending to have a friend.
At the very least, you have some practical constraint out there.
Yeah.
And for most people, I think their hypertrophy will be limited more so by how much time they have than potentially by recovery. So
Totally.
if you're someone who's limited by time, if you can use supersets and all of a sudden go from getting, say, 10, 15 sets for your biceps in a given week to, say, 15, 20 or 20 or 25, and that increases your hypertrophy, that's a huge deal. Even if you enjoy being in the gym, just spend more time in the gym or as much time, but do more volume by using supersets, and that will lead to more growth.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. Anything else on that? What do we miss?
I'll give you a quick practical breakdown of how to apply this, or at least how I like to apply it. The one thing we know is you still want a rest time between one superset and the next. Personally, the way I like to do it is to do exercise A, 1 set, rest about a minute typically, thereabouts, do 1 set of exercise B. Rest about a minute typically, do a set of exercise A again. So having some rest time between each exercise is good. You can certainly auto-regulate because the systemic fatigue from one exercise could definitely bleed over into the next if you take no break.
You're fucking tired 3 seconds after you finish lat pull down. Get out of my face. Lie down for skull crushers. You're not like, all right, here we go. You're like, come on,
That
right?
is not going to be your best set.
100%.
So take a little bit of a break
100%.
at least. You can auto-regulate for sure, but taking a break between each exercise is how I would go about it.
Great.
And generally, I think roughly 2 minutes or so between sets for a given exercise. So for example, you do a set of exercise A, you rest for about 30 seconds to a minute, you do a set of exercise B, rest for about 30 seconds or a minute. That is going to net you around 2 minutes of rest between 2 sets for the same exercise.
Yeah.
Which, from the hypertrophy research on rest times, we know is going to be quite effective by all measures.
Sure. But still shaves off quite a bit of time.
Correct.
Very cool. Very cool, folks. This has been Dr. Milo. He's got his own YouTube. He's got his own Instagram. He may even have his own website that we're not allowed to talk about. Let's catch him on there and learn more science. See you guys next time.